Hello, I'm Will from Studio Bark. As architects, we acknowledge that our work has a significant impact on our environment. Today, I want to go back to basics with a new talk to reassess the impact of our buildings in a world in crisis. 99% of all Earth's energy originates from the sun. The number that quantifies this in watts is very, very big. Theoretically, 90 minutes of the energy that hits the Earth's surface could power global human energy needs for a whole year. How do we convert this for ourselves? Let's look at a simple graph with energy going up and time going across. 300 million years ago, there was a nice fossil called coal. Others, called crude oil and fossil gas, arrived more recently. But fast forward ahead to 8 minutes ago, the sun gave us solar PV, and more recently than that, the wind. The problem with fossil fuels, aside from them being ancient and irreplaceable, is that they must be burnt to produce energy, resulting in CO2. What does this mean? Pre-industrial revolution, we had loads of lovely trees on the earth, and most of the carbon was locked up in the ground. We had balance. Now, in 2020, we have very few trees left, which have been replaced by buildings, industry, and infrastructure. Hence, the carbon has moved from the earth to the atmosphere. Imbalance. Now time for a joke. How much carbon does it take to change a light bulb? First, there's the light bulb, but wait, actually, I might need to have some breakfast if I'm to have the energy to change this light bulb. And that bowl of cereal has a cost, and that cost is roughly 1.2 kilograms of embodied CO2. But wait a minute, I can't reach. I'm going to need a chair. This also has an embodied CO2 cost, noting I will probably use the chair again, not so much the cereal. So then, what's the difference between embodied carbon and in-use carbon? Let's look at another graph. Carbon dioxide going up and time going across. Our LED bulb has an embodied energy cost of 2.4 kilograms of CO2 to the point it's first switched on, then continues to have an in-use CO2 cost during its lifespan. The halogen bulb has a much lower embodied cost, but is much less efficient in use, and therefore both break even in less than 6 months. To recap, the embodied energy is everything before the first use, and the in-use is everything during use. How does this translate into our buildings? Let's take an ordinary masonry building and compare it to an ordinary timber building. The masonry building might have a life expectancy of 150 years, whereas a timber building might be 60. The masonry building releases 200 tons of CO2 during construction. Yes, the weight of about 20 double-decker buses. And if anyone's weighed CO2 before, it's not particularly heavy. The timber building releases 80 tons. Plotting them on a similar graph, you can see that the masonry building has released 200 tons of CO2 once built, and then continues to release CO2 whilst in use. The timber building, however, has released 80 tons of CO2 once built, but after roughly 60 years, the timber building needs to be rebuilt at a further cost of 80 tons. After approximately 100 years, the timber buildings have released more CO2 into the atmosphere. So masonry wins, right? Or is this too simple? Let's look at this again. Same graph, masonry building costing 200 tons of CO2. However, after 10 years, Mr. and Mrs. Jones get married and they decide they want a new kitchen, more CO2. And then in another 10 years, they have a child and decide to redecorate, more CO2. And then that kid grows up and they need an extension, more CO2. But because this building is made out of bricks and mortar and is hard to adapt to a changing climate and changing human needs, it's demolished before reaching the end of its useful life. Let's look at the timber frame. With the same renovations, but the difference is that the timber frame has been designed with circular principles and is ready to be adapted. Nothing goes to landfill and nothing has to be rebuilt. And what does our Prime Minister say about this? Build, build, build. We don't agree. We simply can't put the buildings of the past in landfill today, and we can't put the buildings of today in landfill tomorrow. We need to move towards adaptive reuse for existing buildings and radical adaptability for all new buildings. Looking back at the 1960s, the home computer was something you could walk into, whereas in 2020, it's something you can walk around with. And what about our houses? In the 1900s, they looked a bit like this, probably burning coal. In the 1960s, many switched to gas. And in 2020, you may be able to charge your plug-in hybrid. But one thing you may note, that the buildings haven't changed themselves. So in 2080, Where do I park my flying car? What we build now must be ready for the future, no matter what that future is. We need to stop burning ancient fossil fuels. We need to drive down embodied carbon emissions. We need to move towards a circular economy, and we need to design for radical adaptability. We need to shift technology away from resource extraction, but towards resource circularity. Technologies like augmented reality to help understand the complex recipe of resources that make up our buildings, smart energy systems to reduce our consumption, and we all need to design for disassembly. So what could this future world look like? A world where for every tree chopped down to build with, 5 are planted in its place. Communities build together and learn together. Communities plant and harvest food together. And when the need comes and the community changes, they adapt their buildings together, making sure nothing goes to landfill. We believe that humanity can live with nature rather than against it. Thank you.